Picture driving through Arizona and seeing entire towns with boarded-up main streets, empty schools, and houses selling for the price of a used car. You're witnessing something shocking. Half of Arizona sits virtually abandoned, with ghost towns that were thriving communities just decades ago. What happened here reveals a crisis spreading across the American West that nobody's talking about. The numbers tell a story that most people never see. Right now, 83% of Arizona's 7.4 million residents are crammed into just two metropolitan areas, Phoenix and Tucson. That leaves the remaining 17% scattered across a territory larger than Italy, creating one of the most dramatic population imbalances in America. You're looking at over 200 documented ghost towns across the state, each one a former community where families once built lives, children attended school, and Main Street bustled with activity. These aren't ancient ruins from the 1800s. Many of these places were thriving as recently as the 1980s and 90s. The rural exodus has been devastating. Mining regions have lost 40% of their population since 2000, with entire counties watching their young people disappear. Towns that once supported thousands now struggle to maintain a few dozen residents. The economic foundation shifted beneath their feet as Arizona transformed from a resource extraction economy to urban tech and service jobs concentrated in metropolitan areas. Drive through places like Chloride, Ruby, or Vulture City today, and you'll see the evidence everywhere. Empty storefronts line streets where businesses once competed for customers. Schools built for hundreds of students now serve as community centers for a handful of seniors. Houses that cost six figures to build now sell for less than $20,000, if they sell at all. But these statistics only scratch the surface. The real question is what specific forces drove people away from these once thriving communities? And the answer starts with an industry that built Arizona, but ultimately abandoned it. Arizona's mining industry didn't just decline, it collapsed like a controlled demolition. In 1980, copper mining alone employed 25,000 workers across the state. Today, that number has plummeted to just 8,000, and most of those jobs are concentrated in a handful of highly automated operations that need far fewer people. You can see the devastation most clearly in Jerome, perched on Cleopatra Hill in the Verde Valley. This former copper boomtown once housed 15,000 residents who worked the mines that produced 3 billion pounds of copper. When the mines closed in 1953, Jerome lost 95% of its population. Today, fewer than 500 people call it home. Bisbee tells a similar story. The Queen Mine and Lavender Pit employed thousands of workers and supported a thriving community of 20,000 people. Now Bisbee struggles to maintain 5,000 residents, many of them retirees and artists drawn by cheap real estate rather than employment opportunities. These towns made a fatal mistake. They built their entire existence around a single industry. When global copper prices dropped and foreign competition increased, there was no plan B, no diversified economy, no alternative employers, no economic cushion to soften the blow. The mines that created these communities also doomed them. What's particularly tragic is how quickly it happened. Families who had lived in these places for generations watched their hometowns empty out in just a few years as the economic foundation crumbled beneath them. But mining wasn't the only industry that left entire communities stranded when progress passed them by. Progress literally drove past these communities at 70 miles per hour. When Interstate 40 replaced the famous Route 66 in 1984, it didn't just change how Americans traveled. It killed entire towns that had grown up around the old highway. Suddenly, millions of travelers who once stopped for buying food and lodging were speeding past on a new route that bypassed these communities completely. The railroad industry delivered an even more devastating blow. Arizona's railroad employment dropped 70% since 1990 as companies consolidated operations and automated systems. Small depot towns that once served as crucial links in America's transportation network found themselves obsolete overnight. You can drive through places like Two Guns and Winona today and see exactly what happens when progress leaves you behind. Two Guns, once a thriving stop on Route 66, is now nothing but crumbling concrete and rusted metal. Winona, immortalized in the Eagles' song "Take It Easy," became a ghost town so quickly that some buildings still have merchandise on the shelves. The freight railroad consolidation was particularly brutal for small communities. Towns that had grown around water stops, repair facilities, and crew change points discovered that modern trains could travel much longer distances without stopping. Why maintain dozens of small depots when a few large hubs could handle the same volume more efficiently? These weren't gradual declines spanning decades. When the transportation routes changed, businesses closed within months and families moved away within years, leaving behind empty buildings and broken dreams. Even as traditional industries collapsed, Arizona faced an even more fundamental challenge that would determine which communities could survive at all. Water is the silent killer of Arizona's small towns, and the math is terrifying. Arizona uses 40% more water than it receives annually, creating an unsustainable deficit that's been growing for decades. You're looking at a state that's essentially borrowing water from the future, and small communities are the first to lose when the bill comes due. The groundwater crisis hits rural areas hardest. 80% of rural wells across Arizona are experiencing depletion, forcing families to drill deeper and deeper until the cost becomes unbearable. Some communities have watched their wells go dry completely, leaving residents with no choice but to abandon homes their families built generations ago. Small towns can't compete with Phoenix and Tucson in the water rights game. When push comes to shove, metropolitan areas with millions of residents and billions in economic activity will always outbid rural communities of a few hundred people. It's simple economics, but the human cost is devastating. Climate change has made everything worse. The Colorado River allocation to Arizona has been reduced by 25% due to prolonged drought conditions, and scientists predict further cuts are coming. Lake Mead, which supplies much of Arizona's water, sits at historically low levels with no recovery in sight. What happens when a town runs out of water? You don't get a grace period or government bailout. Businesses close, families move away, and the community dies. It's happening right now across rural Arizona, one dry well at a time. Water shortages created the conditions for abandonment, but extreme weather delivered the final blow that made these places truly unlivable. Arizona's climate has become genuinely dangerous to human life. In 2023, Phoenix endured 31 consecutive days above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, shattering previous records and creating conditions that would have been considered unlivable just a generation ago. But Phoenix has massive infrastructure to cope with extreme heat. Rural Arizona doesn't. Small towns across the state lack the electrical grid capacity, emergency cooling centers, and medical facilities needed to handle these temperature extremes. When the mercury hits 115 degrees and stays there for weeks, older residents face life-threatening conditions with nowhere to go for relief. The wildfire situation has become catastrophic. Fire risk has increased 300% in the past decade as drought conditions create tinderbox environments across rural Arizona. Communities that once felt safe now live under constant threat of evacuation orders, and many families have lost everything to fires that spread faster than anyone anticipated. Summer energy costs tell the story of a place becoming uninhabitable. Residents in small towns regularly face electricity bills exceeding $400 per month just to keep their homes livable. And that's assuming the aging electrical infrastructure can handle the load. Power outages during heat waves aren't just inconvenient, they're potentially fatal. You're watching climate change transform Arizona into a place where human settlement becomes increasingly difficult, especially for the elderly and economically vulnerable populations that make up much of rural Arizona's remaining residents. The physical environment became hostile, but human systems were failing too, creating a perfect storm that would finish off communities already hanging by a thread. When essential services disappear, communities don't just decline, they become uninhabitable. Since 2010, 47 rural Arizona schools have closed their doors permanently, forcing children to travel hours each day for education or compelling families to relocate entirely. You can't raise a family in a place where your kids can't go to school. Healthcare access has become a life or death issue. In many rural Arizona communities, the nearest hospital is over 100 miles away. When someone has a heart attack or stroke, that distance becomes a death sentence. Emergency medical services are stretched so thin that response times can exceed an hour, assuming help can even reach remote locations. The digital divide has made isolation even worse. 60% of rural Arizona still struggles with internet speeds under 10 megabits per second, making remote work impossible and cutting residents off from modern communication. In an age where reliable internet is as essential as electricity, these communities are being left in the digital dark ages. Young families face an impossible choice: stay in a place they love but can't provide adequate opportunities for their children, or leave for better schools, healthcare, and connectivity. Most choose to leave, creating a devastating brain drain that accelerates community decline. What happens when a town loses its school, its clinic, and its connection to the modern world? The remaining residents become increasingly isolated, older, and unable to attract new families or businesses that might revive the community. As services vanished, the economic foundation crumbled beneath entire communities, creating a real estate nightmare that trapped the people who couldn't afford to leave. The real estate market in Arizona's dying towns has created a financial prison for thousands of families. The median home price in these ghost towns has collapsed to just $45,000, and that's for properties that actually manage to sell. You're looking at houses that cost $150,000 to build, now selling for less than the price of a decent used car. Imagine owning a home that's become literally worthless. Families who invested their life savings in these properties now face an impossible situation. They can't sell because there are no buyers, they can't rent because there are no renters, and they can't afford to simply walk away because they're still responsible for mortgage payments and property taxes. The property tax burden adds insult to injury. Counties still assess taxes on land that has no market value, forcing residents to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars annually for the privilege of owning property nobody wants. Some families spend more on property taxes than their homes are worth on the open market. Real estate agents have simply stopped serving many of these areas. When houses sit on the market for years without a single showing, there's no economic incentive for professionals to waste their time. Residents become trapped, watching their neighbors abandon homes rather than continue paying for worthless property. This creates a vicious cycle. As more homes are abandoned, property values fall further, making it even harder for remaining residents to escape. Entire neighborhoods become graveyards of broken dreams and financial ruin. The housing crisis reveals deeper economic forces at work, including failed attempts to breathe new life into dying communities through industries that promised salvation but delivered disappointment. Tourism was supposed to be the savior of Arizona's dying towns, but it became another cruel disappointment. State and local governments have invested millions of dollars in historic route marketing campaigns, antique signage, and visitor centers that attract minimal traffic and generate even less revenue. You can drive through these communities today and see the faded tourism infrastructure that promised economic revival but delivered empty parking lots. The harsh reality is that most tourists stick to the main attractions. They visit Phoenix, Scottsdale, Flagstaff, and the Grand Canyon, then drive straight through the small towns without stopping. Why would someone spend the night in a struggling rural community when they can stay in a modern hotel with amenities just an hour down the road? Seasonal tourism creates its own problems. Even towns that do attract visitors find themselves dependent on a few busy months each year, leaving businesses struggling to survive during the long off-seasons. You can't pay year-round expenses with 3 months of tourist dollars, especially when those tourists are mostly day trippers who don't spend much money. Perhaps most frustrating, authentic ghost towns now compete with manufactured tourist attractions. Theme parks and resort destinations offer sanitized versions of the Old West experience with air conditioning, gift shops, and reliable parking. Real ghost towns offer authenticity but lack the convenience modern tourists expect. The tourism strategy ignored a fundamental truth. People visit these places because they're empty and historic, not because they're vibrant communities where you'd want to spend money or time. Even creative solutions couldn't overcome the fundamental challenges facing these communities. And some new developments are repeating the same mistakes that created Arizona's ghost towns in the first place. Arizona is making the exact same mistakes all over again, just with different resources. Solar farms are creating new boom towns across the desert, bringing temporary construction jobs and promises of economic revival that sound eerily familiar to anyone who remembers the mining and railroad booms of the past century. You can see the pattern repeating in places like Buckeye and Casa Grande, where massive solar installations employ hundreds of workers during construction phases. But what happens when the solar farms are built and only need a skeleton crew for maintenance? These communities are betting their futures on an industry that will inevitably move toward automation and centralized operations. New residential developments are sprouting in locations that make no long-term sense. Developers continue building communities in areas with questionable water access, extreme heat exposure, and limited transportation infrastructure. They're selling water rights to fund these projects despite Arizona's ongoing water crisis, essentially trading future sustainability for short-term profits. The most troubling part is how closely this mirrors Arizona's historical pattern. Mining towns, railroad stops, and Route 66 communities all followed the same cycle. Initial resource extraction or strategic advantage, rapid population growth, economic dependence on a single industry, then inevitable decline when technology or economics shifted. Today's solar boom towns are making the same fundamental error that doomed their predecessors, building entire communities around industries that are inherently temporary or subject to technological disruption. When solar technology advances or energy policies change, these new communities could easily become tomorrow's ghost towns. Understanding these patterns reveals what the future holds for Arizona's settlement, and the implications extend far beyond state borders. Arizona's abandoned communities are a crystal ball showing America's future settlement patterns. Climate migration will accelerate the abandonment processes as temperatures continue rising and water becomes even scarcer. Scientists predict that by 2050, large portions of the Southwest will experience conditions that challenge human habitability for much of the year. Technology offers a glimmer of hope for some communities. High-speed internet and remote work capabilities could revive towns with scenic beauty but limited traditional employment opportunities. A few Arizona ghost towns are already seeing small influxes of digital nomads and remote workers attracted by cheap real estate and natural beauty, though these populations remain tiny and economically fragile. Water policy will ultimately determine which communities survive. Towns with senior water rights and sustainable sources might weather the crisis, while those dependent on depleted aquifers or junior water rights face inevitable abandonment. The math is unforgiving. You can't maintain a community without reliable water access. Arizona's demographic shifts preview what's coming across the American West. Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and parts of California are experiencing similar patterns of rural abandonment combined with unsustainable urban growth. Climate change and resource scarcity will force difficult choices about where Americans can realistically live in the coming decades. The empty half of Arizona isn't just about one state, it's a warning about how quickly thriving communities can become modern ghost towns. Every abandoned building and empty main street tells the same story. When the fundamental conditions for human settlement change, even established communities with deep roots can vanish faster than anyone imagines possible.